Chapter 7. Rash awoke slowly, his mind hazy. He didn't really remember where he was. He lived in Blue Creek, Oregon, and remembered that much. He and his wife, Shari, and their 2 boys. They'd moved out here to be safe after that mess in New York. He wasn't at home now, though, was he? Whatever he was lying on, it didn't feel like an ordinary bed. He opened his eyes. At first he saw only darkness, then bright light, painfully bright, cut through the dark, blinding him. He closed his eyes again, still trying to collect his thoughts. That mess back in New York. Who were those things really? What were they? Why were they here? Would they come back? Would they come back for him? Schaefer had them all figured out, but Rash had never really understood it. Hunters from space, yeah, but why? How did they decide who to hunt? Where would he be safe? Anywhere? Was Blue Creek far enough away? He couldn't stop thinking about them, couldn't stop remembering the strange masks and the hideous faces underneath, their yellow flesh and black talons, the dripping blood and mutilated bodies of their victims. He blinked. He felt as if he had been drugged. Had he? He couldn't remember. He still couldn't remember where he was, how he had gotten there. He tried to see through the light, through the mental haze. A mask. He saw a mask hovering over him, and long yellow fingers were reaching towards his face. It was one of them, he realized, one of the things from outer space. "He's awake," someone said. Rash forced himself to act, suddenly and decisively. He wasn't a young man. He looked overweight and out of shape, but he could still move fast and hard when he needed to. And he moved now, lunging at the thing in the mask, his hands reaching for its throat as he shouted, "Not again! You won't get away again! This time I'm taking you down with me!" His foe went over backward and tumbled to the floor. Rash landed on his opponent's chest, and that unbearably bright light was behind him instead of in his eyes, so that he could see clearly again. A woman shrieked, "Sheriff Rash, please, stop it!" Rash looked down and saw that the shadowy figure wasn't what he had thought. The mask was white paper over gauze, not alien metal. The throat in his hands was human. The yellow fingers were rubber gloves, and Rash knew he couldn't have knocked over one of those alien predators anywhere near so easily. He released his hold. Then at last the mental haze cleared, and Rash realized he was kneeling atop his dentist. "Dr. Krellmore," he said, suddenly remembering the man's name. Krellmore made a choking noise. I'm sorry," Rash said, as he got off his victim. "The gas, "The gas!" Krellmore said, as his hygienist helped him up off the floor. "I was imagining things that weren't there," Rash said. "Hallucinating, I guess." "Hallucinating?" Krellmore brushed himself off. "I'm just a dentist, Sheriff. But I never saw anyone react like that just to gas." He coughed. "Your filling's all done. But maybe you'd be better off consulting, a psychiatrist or something." Rash shook his head. "I've seen enough psychiatrists to diagnose the entire state of Florida," he said. More to himself than the others, he added, "Jesus, I really thought I was over it." He looked at Dr. Krellmore. "I had this real bad time," he began. Then he caught himself. Telling his dentist that he'd been involved in a secret war against alien monsters on the streets of New York was not exactly a good career move. "Look, Doc," he said, "I'm really sorry for what happened. I'd appreciate it if you could keep this under your hat." He managed a sickly smile. "I've been under a lot of stress lately, New place, new job. I'm still getting settled in." "Sure," Krellmore said, rubbing his neck. The red marks left by Rash's chokehold were already fading. "Sure. No problem, Sheriff. Your secret's safe with me." He forced a weak grin in response to Rash's smile. "Every time they show Marathon Man on TV, it's the same damn thing. You'd think I'd be used to it by now." "Nobody's ever..." the hygienist began, then stopped as both men turned unhappily to face her, afraid she was going to say something they'd all regret. "Well, we've had some upset patients before," she said, "but I think you're the first one to actually take Dr. Crowmore down like that." Crowmore's smile reappeared. "Best 2 falls out of 3? He asked. No one quite managed to laugh. 10 minutes later, Rash was out on the streets of Blue Creek, thinking hard as he automatically scanned his surroundings, cop fashion. He didn't like losing control like that. Yeah, he'd been out of it from the gas, but trying to strangle a harmless tooth doctor was not a good sign even so. He'd been the local sheriff in Blue Creek for a little over 4 months now, and he'd mostly thought he'd been settling in nicely. He'd thought that he'd left all the freaks and crazies behind when he quit the NYPD and went west, but now he wondered whether maybe one of the crazies hadn't moved out west right alongside him, right inside his own head. He walked on automatically as he thought, taking in everything around him, unconsciously classifying everyone he saw into one of 3 categories, the traditional New York cop triage. The 3 categories were cops, citizens, and scum. Back in the Big Apple, he'd always seen a mix, but here in Blue Creek he only seemed to see citizens. That had been the whole point of moving here, of course, but it still didn't seem entirely natural. He'd spent almost his whole life in New York. If it hadn't been for those monsters from Planet X, he'd undoubtedly still be there, probably still working homicide or narco with his partner Schaefer, finishing out his time until retirement. The spaceships and the all-out firefight on 3rd Avenue had been too much for him, though. He'd left. He'd found the job as sheriff, gathered up Shari and the kids, and come out here, where it was safe. Or safer, anyway. He glanced up at the sky. He couldn't be sure anywhere was really safe, but Blue Creek seemed like a pretty good bet. Rash had been pleased to get the job offer. He'd sent out his resume from the hospital, and the reply from Blue Creek had been waiting when he was released. He'd grabbed it. He'd asked Shafe to come with him, but the big man had refused. Rash had even offered him a job as deputy, and Schaefer had smiled so broadly Rash thought he might actually laugh, which would have been a first, Schaefer actually laughing at anything Rash said. Rash had to admit that the idea of Schaefer playing Barney Fife to Rash's Sheriff Taylor was pretty absurd, but he'd kept asking for as long as he could. It hadn't worked. Schaefer had stayed in New York. It wasn't that Schaefer loved the city all that much. He didn't. Sometimes Rash thought that Schaefer hated the place. And it wasn't that he'd never lived anywhere else. Schaefer wasn't a native New Yorker. Rash thought he'd grown up in Pennsylvania somewhere, though he wasn't sure. Schaefer had never really said where he came from. No, Schaefer stayed in New York because he wasn't going to let those alien things drive him out, and he wasn't going to let the government order him around. Rash knew that, and understood it. Other people had wanted Schaefer to go away. People Schaefer didn't like, and that was the surest way to get Schaefer to stay put. As long as the feds wanted Schaefer out of New York, he wasn't going to leave the city. Not for Rash, not for anyone. Besides, Rash thought, Schaefer was still pissed off about the government covering up the mess, still pissed off that they hadn't told him what had happened to his brother Dutch, the covert operative, after Dutch had disappeared on a rescue mission in Central America. Staying in New York meant that Schaefer would have more people to take that anger out on. Rash unlocked the front door of the split level that still didn't quite feel like home, the split level that was about 3 times the size of their old place in Queens, and stepped inside. As he did, a photo of Schaefer and himself, standing on an end table in the living room, caught his eye. He ambled over and picked it up. That was right after they'd taken down a vicious little bastard who had called himself Errol G. Rash remembered it well as he looked down at his own face. There he was, a big grin making his moustache bristle, while Schaefer's face could have been carved out of stone. He wondered what Schaefer was doing right at that moment. He wondered whether Schaefer still had nightmares about those creatures. He wondered whether Schaefer ever had nightmares about anything. Schaefer didn't seem the nightmare-having type somehow. Nightmare-causing, yeah. Rash could think of a few people who might have nightmares about Schaefer. He smiled at the thought. He'd have to call Schaefer, just to chat sometime soon. The smile vanished. He needed to talk to somebody about those things, Somebody other than the psychologists who thought the aliens were stress-induced hallucinations. Somebody other than Shari, who, sweet as she was, never knew what to say about the grimmer aspects of Rash's work. Yeah, he'd call Schaefer soon. Very soon.